Everybody. If you don't want to be on the recording, feel free to turn off your video. Welcome everybody to this webinar hosted by the Shingwauk Residential School Center. My name is Krista McCracken. I'm the researcher curator at the SRSC. Just want to start off by acknowledging that the Shingwauk Residential School Center is located on Robinson Huron Treaty Territory, specifically the lands of Garden River First Nation, Batchewana First Nation, and the historic Métis community. We're also located on the site of the former Shingwauk Residential School. So we're really grateful today to have Skylee-Storm Hogan-Stacey with us to talk about commemoration. Skylee-Storm is a historian with no history, an Ottawa-based consulting firm, and they have worked on a variety of public history, archival, and oral history commemoration projects that center the experience and voices of Indigenous people. We're really grateful to have Skylee-Storm here with us today, and I'll turn it over to them to get started.
Thanks, Krista. So I will share my screen here and it'll just be a sec. And can everyone see the full screen slide? Perfect, thanks, Krista. So as introduced, my name is Skylee-Storm Hogan. My father's name is Stacey, and I'm a public historian and historian with no history based in the unceded Algonquin territory in what is now known as Ottawa, Ontario. So just a little bit of an intro here. I do a lot of different types of work. And my hope here is to talk for around 45 minutes and have about 15 minutes for any questions that folks have. Just to introduce myself, my personal philosophy in public history work is to be inclusive of community voices and focus not just on the truth, but on the context of historical narratives. I've been privileged to work with No History on a variety of Indigenous projects for Indigenous clients and community partners to create and support heritage projects that honor and showcase the community's voice. Our work is guided directly by the wishes of the Indigenous communities involved and organizations we work with. And it's a value I take very seriously since my time working with the Shingwauk Residential School Center, where we took direction directly from residential school survivors and the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association. So commemoration, why do we have commemoration? There's a lot of people who explore this in entire dissertations, but to be brief, some of these reasons are personal, ceremonial, educational, or political. It can also be a combination of these reasons. Most official commemoration commissioned by governments, public institutions, or through grant funds are results of educational and political motives. They want to commemorate something to generate interest in the history of the community or the country. And they also seek to highlight a story that will resonate with communities or individuals they feel are key to government objectives. So according to Yvonne Whalen, commemorating an individual or an event, public monuments are not merely ornamental features of the urban landscape, but rather highly symbolic signifiers that confer meaning on the city and transform neutral spaces into ideologically charged sites. Nation building is a key component for large bronze and stone monuments that we see in central areas of our communities and in our nation's capital. Withstanding time, weather, while looming over streets larger than life, when we can look at the context of when commemoration happens, it actually can teach us more about the time period in which it was created rather than the commemoration it's meant to educate us on. This means that commemoration is targeted to specific audiences, which becomes less relevant as society evolves and starts to look at new avenues of historical analysis. So looking even at this slide here, a lot of the monuments on the Capitol were created at times when, the governments in power, the people commissioning these monuments or commemorative plaques were really looking to unite and show a specific type of message. The time from when the War Memorial was created to when the Indigenous Veterans Memorial was created, a lot of different things happened, a lot of shifting political priorities. In addition, a lot of the monuments in Tiohtià:ke, which we now call Montreal, were created during times of, French language minority advocacy. And a lot of those things are meant to confer that type of message. Looking at the provincial system, so here in Ontario, we have the Ontario Heritage Trust and the Provincial Plaque Program, which is similar to the national program. But commemoration isn't just about large statues. The same can be said for plaques. While textual, what is omitted is just as important of a signifier as what is said. The Provincial Plaque Program run by the Ontario Heritage Trust describes the program as the oldest and perhaps best known activity of the department, with nearly 1,300 familiar blue and gold plaques in communities across Ontario. The plaques are there to really draw attention to different sites that the province feels are historically significant in the story of the province. They're meant to enrich our sense of place, introduce newcomers and visitors to the unique character of regions, communities, and nations within the province. However, the plaque program has acknowledged that their materials might be outdated, as the program has run for over half a century. So with a lot of those plaques reaching back more than 60 years, the trust has reached out to many people or has started to re-examine a lot of the historical analysis and writing that has gone on in those plaques, because some of that interpretation has included outdated terminology related to culture, race, and gender, as well as missing narratives for people who weren't considered historically significant in the time periods of when these things were written. So there was always unveiling events for most plaques, but what you can see here is a more modern unveiling event. So my first example is the plaque outside of the Mohawk Institute. This plaque was rewritten and unveiled in 1996. So the original was created in 1972. As you can see, hopefully, this plaque talks about the forced assimilation of Indigenous children because it was a known fact by 1996. And after the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, it became a heritage priority to be more honest about residential schools. Although this plaque does not mention the abuses students suffered throughout the school's operation, it does address the removal of culture, which is something the original plaque disregarded entirely. The original plaque on the site was created by a former principal and the local historical society in Brantford, of which that principal was a former chair. So he had a lot of say in what went on that plaque. In addition, a lot of that plaque information was ran by the Department of Indian Affairs. The original plaque had a celebratory tone, focused on the built heritage and the school's mission of vocational training. It was unveiled in 1972, but it was stolen from the site in 1991, and it was never found. This site story is very similar to the plaque that is currently at the Shingwauk Hall site. So the Shingwauk Hall plaque was unveiled in 1977 with an event hosted by the Anglican Church. Like the original Mohawk Institute plaque unveiled in 1972, this plaque focuses on the celebratory rather than harms. The good-natured narratives of the principal E.F. Wilson and his quest to fulfill Shingwauk's vision. But there's a lot I could say on that subject, but I'll be brief in saying that it's not the reality of what happened at this site. Regardless of the intentions of historical figures that historians place upon figures of the past, we must realize that commemoration in the present day needs to include the fact that most of our historical figures lived in systems built on the foundation of eugenic science and white supremacy. If this plaque included the voices of the community this site impacted, it wouldn't have been vandalized or criticized throughout the years. Community heritage and government heritage need to include more voices in the creation of their work, or choose someone they know who will consult communities and provide the right historical analysis for the times we live in. So this plaque originally was a combined effort, much like the Mohawk Institute. It was a collaboration between the Anglican Church, local historians, and other folks. I am not sure how much involvement folks from the local communities had, or even what survivors had, because this was long before the first Shingwauk Survivors Reunion in 1981. So this is the current plaque. And its text talks about the tutelage of E.F. Wilson and providing Indian children with religious instruction, occupational training, and homemaking skills. It does mention the fire within 6 days of opening, but I mean, it doesn't really give a lot of context. It also makes it seem like this was simply a school, and it doesn't really mention the wider residential school system and the impacts that it has on Indigenous people even today. This plaque has been criticized by the community and those who study what has happened on the site. Sorry, 1 second. It's a little dry in here. I've been asked to rewrite the plaque for Shingwauk Hall on the present site of Algonquin University by the Ontario Heritage Trust. My assigned project is to review the original text, develop a short background history of the site with its historic significance identified, prepare a bibliography, write 165-word text that will go on the new plaque, and provide 8 to 10 audiovisual resources, and suggest individuals and other collections for further review. And a big part of this work is suggesting languages in which this text can be translated. Because the Shingwauk School had students all the way from James Bay to Southern Ontario and from Western Canada, this could include a lot of different folks. So I'm happy to suggest more than 2 or 3 languages for this plaque. Currently, I'm in the stage of writing the short historical background and creating my bibliography. But once my plaque text is finished, I will be sending it off to the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association and the Shingwauk Residential School Center for comments, review. I chose these consultations because the Shingwauk Hall belongs to the survivors, in my opinion. They are the community that I want to serve. But what does this mean? Why bother with the plaque? While I was working at the site, we saw hundreds of people per semester with a demand that increased after the TRC made their final report. And Krista used to run statistics, and it was mind-blowing how many people came through for tours, how many people were engaging with the site. But we can't always be open to tours and visitors, especially now with a global pandemic. It's important to have this accurate information approved by the survivor community and accessible to the public without a physical interpreter. The extra context on the Ontario Heritage Trust website will add to the context and availability to learn more about the site from a broader historical analysis that has been approved and informed by the survivor community. So coming to what public historians can do. I feel fortunate as I've had a good knowledge of the Shingwauk Hall site, the archives, and relationships with the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association. But it also helps to bring an Indigenous perspective to this work. My father is from the Mohawk Nation of Gotnawage, and I've been privileged to spend the last couple of years regularly visiting the community, staying with family, talking with elders, and getting to understand, you know, the importance of history and legacy in commemoration work and in public history work. But it's also possible for allied organizations and public historians to affect change in commemoration as well. But where do public historians start? A key thing I like to say that I've learned from training with an organization called Find the Outside is power matters first and foremost. So this is for folks who, you know, are higher up on the hierarchical structure of their public history career or are on heritage boards. So if you're on committees, suggest building relationships with Indigenous communities in your area long before you intend to ask them for their help in revamping your existing commemoration, or before you decide to create something new, because they likely would like to be involved in that process. But Indigenous people, kind of as a disclaimer, and this goes generally for Black folks and people of color, is Indigenous people do not owe you their kindness, their presence, or their voice. Be prepared to work on building this trust over time and have patience. It's not going to happen right away. I know sometimes with tight deadlines, we would like things to go a little bit faster, but that's not always how Indigenous folks and Indigenous communities work. Every community has different protocols and has different ways of making decisions, and they have varied priorities. A lot of communities are in active health crisis. A lot of communities are having issues in governance and treaty rights, in economic development. They might not always have your heritage project on the top of their agenda. But if you are in a position of power for an organization, whether that's public or private, or you're an individual historical researcher or historian, I know it's hard to do, but try to take yourself out of the limelight. It can be tempting for a lot of academics, museum professionals, heritage professionals, and public historians to want to be in the spotlight or sell their brand. This won't always be appropriate, especially if you're an established or senior level historian. Instead, accept you have a comfortable life, a steady career, and promote Indigenous, Black, or historians of color to do this important reimagining work. And my advice with that is pay them well, build them up, help them network, and mentor them. This is reconciliation and community building of a different kind. Reconciliation isn't always land acknowledgements, broad statements of support, creating a small exhibition in the corner of your site. It is actually building relationships and supporting people from those communities. So my usual advice is to engage with folks and build those things. My next tip is consult, and consult some more. I've learned while working on many Indigenous projects that what works in my community may not translate to Western communities or Northern Ontario. Even within Northern Ontario, there are communities that won't see things the same way. You won't please everyone all the time, but it's important to identify the communities you wish to serve and address and include those voices in the best ways that you can. I know personally, I've had moments in Sault Ste. Marie where, you know, we've gotten the community to work well together, but, you know, there's always a couple individuals who maybe don't agree with the main, and we have to make concessions or try to create compromise or understand that, you know, not everything is a monolith and not everyone's going to see things the same way. Even in my father's community in Kahnawake, there's different longhouses. There's folks who are okay with the band government. There's folks who are not okay with the band government. There are folks who support certain types of heritage projects as long as they're not aligned with an organization that they don't want to partner with. So, I mean, it's going to be a delicate dance with Indigenous communities, and you have to try your best to come from a place of understanding and, again, patience in order to make your projects work. And another thing that I'm going to point out here is if your commemoration includes a sculpture or art piece, approach Indigenous artists or have a call for proposals seeking only Indigenous artists. Give preference to the artists in the community or communities you are consulting or trying to serve. If you do not, if you need to do this project on yourself or on a tight deadline, either because of financial or time constraints, I know a lot of grants, this can be difficult to do, or if you're not in charge. I mean, that's the case for a lot of us who are emerging or who are working in a larger organization. We don't call the shots. We're not the ones doing the consulting. We're not the people who are in power. But what you can do on a micro level instead of a macro level is make sure you do as much research as possible from Indigenous sources. So that's trying to use, you know, YouTube videos. You can look at Indigenous authors. You can attend a lecture by an Indigenous academic. You can, you know, prepare a small gift. So something that's relevant to the community, you'd have to do research on that. So things like, you know, maple syrup, wild rice, traditional medicines, or just like a bundle gift, a small honorarium, and reach out to a knowledge keeper and ask them for some initial advice when doing your project. That's something that you can do as well. But it's important, if you don't have resources, to try and use the time and resources of Indigenous people as little as possible. If you can't provide for a knowledge exchange, then go to community events in your off time and really just read Indigenous authors and immerse yourself in that culture. Of course, this list is not exhaustive. You learn a lot on the go, and it can be situational to your project. The biggest thing that I've learned is patience again, and that I'm never going to be done learning. While I was at Algoma University, Grand Chief Badwayan, who's since passed on, said that the road to knowledge is eternal, and that is completely true for professional historians. You don't know everything. And that's especially true for the evolving case of historical analysis. It changes year to year, month to month. Elders will teach you something new constantly, but so will the voices of Indigenous youth. Elders and communities regularly try to engage with Indigenous youth to keep their perspectives fresh, because a lot of us can settle in when we get into older age. Without collaboration, consultation, commemorative practices and public history will cease to be relevant. Not only this plaque has been flagged for rewrite, there's been hundreds of plaques like that have been flagged for rewrites when I was having discussions with the Ontario Heritage Trust. And their biggest thing is, they're just so backed up on trying to find people to rewrite these, or trying to figure out if these sites are even still significant to the province now with what we know about our histories. I've personally faced some criticism. So I know that talking to other public historians who are maybe afraid to broach this subject with, their board of directors, their executive team, or even volunteers, it can be a difficult conversation, because a lot of us are being accused of revisionist history, of politicizing history, or changing the narrative of Canada. But I think, in my own personal opinion, this isn't the opinion of the people that I work for, but it is the opinion of some people that I work with, but I don't want to speak for anyone. I think that historical analysis needs to evolve. It needs to be conscious of the fact that when we explore history, when we explore commemoration, we explore historical analysis, it is much as of a reflection of today as it was of the past. And what we know about different folks in history is really dependent on the documents and the things that we have access to. So when people, accuse us of maybe politicizing our exhibitions, our commemoration, our events, I think it's good to challenge that and say, well, these things were politicized to begin with. There's a lot of research into the commemoration of residential schools in general. When I spoke earlier about the Mohawk Institute, there's a lot of back and forth over what exactly they would mention on this plaque and what they would omit. And I feel that history, when we're omitting certain things, it's really just telling us more about the story that we're trying to tell. Creating a more equitable representation of our past really helps identify what needs to be done in the present. The past policies of the Ontario Heritage Trust were often to work with expert historians, often clergymen, professors, lawyers, in creating a summary of significance for a particular site. But those people were coming from particular backgrounds. And when I mentioned, promoting and working with and building important relationships with Indigenous historians, that really comes to that point, is representation is a big part of what people are calling reconciliation. It's making space for Indigenous people to be an active member of exhibitions, commemoration. And when, we're obsessed with creating a humanitarian brand or creating a certain type of image, I think it's important to actually do the work and put ourselves behind it. But as usual, I've talked very, very quickly over my very long document. So I think I'm actually ready to jump into questions and a discussion, just because I see the little chat bubble jumping up. So I think it might be a good time to kind of talk a little bit about that, and hopefully I can share some more information to specific situational questions, or even just offer some insights into the work that I'm doing.
Great. Thanks so much, Skylee-Storm. Really appreciate your perspectives and you being so open and sharing today. There is one question in the chat already from Hillary, and it's really about the Shingwauk site, so I'll just read it and feel free to respond. Hillary says, so many people in the Sault Ste. Marie community admire that church structure simply as a beautiful piece of architecture, missing the fact of the child labor that was used to build it. Will this be acknowledged in the new plaque?
I would have liked to have seen it acknowledged in the plaque. However, the plaque, although placed beside the Bishop Fouquet Memorial Chapel, is about Shingwauk Hall. The Bishop Fouquet Memorial Chapel doesn't have its own plaque, which I think would be a really great suggestion for future initiatives for the site. I could also, yes, make a mention of, it's home to the Bishop Fouquet Memorial Chapel, one of the oldest structures in Sault Ste. Marie. And it was built by child labor, but I'm sure I will get some feedback about the length of this plaque. So I'm trying to be conscious of that. And it is a good point, but yeah, the focus on Shingwauk Hall, I find it's a bit limiting to talk about the entire encapsulated significance of that site, which is immense, not only for Ontario, but for a lot of different places in Canada and a lot of communities.
Thanks so much. So Bill, I see your hand.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have two, I don't want to take up all your time, but I have two questions that are very different spectrums. One question is, with the construction of new plaques, do you think that you could include like a QR code or some type of thing to hyperlink people to like a digital space? Because obviously these plaques take time and effort, and there's always a phenomenal amount of work that goes into behind it. But do you think that with this commemoration and everyone having smartphones, as you go down a walking path, there's QR codes for like, hey, like scan this and do 10 jumping jacks and you can, so just wondering, your thoughts on that. And the other one is a little bit grander. What do you feel about, I'm an archaeological, I'm an Indigenous archaeologist, and what I found is sometimes when we're dealing with a very big site, a proponent wants to give honor and respect to the site, but never wanting it on the site. They won't succumb. They don't want to sacrifice some of the land or the project. So they want to build a plaque, maybe a kilometer or two away, to give honor to a site. And I just want to know if you have any insight on, because I deal with a lot of corporation and a lot of proponents, like, how do you feel about a private industry coming up with just their own memorialization that is nowhere near an actual site of reference? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Those are both excellent questions. I appreciate them. Well, to answer your first question, I think there is a plan to have some type of digital accompaniment to this plaque. The Ontario Heritage Trust, I talked with them a little bit about the project plan for this revamp, as well as their future ideas for the Provincial Plaque program. And a big component is the website. A lot of that work is being revamped right now, and they're big on wanting to find audiovisual resources to pair with the plaque. And I think a QR code would be a great solution to that. Of course, the plaque is cast in bronze, so it's a little bit hard to incorporate the QR code right on the plaque, but I think it would be a great idea for them to maybe include it on like the little pole that it's affixed to, or even on the extra signage that's going to be in other languages. That way, yeah, folks, if they're just walking by, they see the plaque, they read it, they're interested, they can scan it, see the audiovisual resources. Their hope in the future is to have oral history interviews or people interviewed about the site itself. So, I mean, we are actively losing our elders, our survivors, obviously, which is incredibly painful. But at the same time, we do have the fortune of the Shingwauk Residential School Center archives that has some folks talking, you know, in the first reunion or in different times for different interviews. So yeah, having those linked to the plaque is going to be integral. Having the longer history piece is going to be integral. I believe, Hillary, that's a piece where I can incorporate the issue of the chapel completely. So just like having different context attached to the plaque is definitely in the plan, and it's a part of their digital plan. The issue, of course, with that is digital accessibility. In Sault Ste. Marie, some folks do not have data. A lot of people can't afford it or they rely on Wi-Fi. But I mean, in the future, hopefully that's less of an issue. Getting to your second question about corporation and private monuments, I did for a time work at the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, so I'm familiar with a little bit of private enterprise, quote unquote, goodwill initiatives, especially from developers, which I'd always felt a little bit odd about, or like people like Enbridge, I always felt like really odd about. But I think it's key to, I know that we're not always in positions of power in organizations, especially as Indigenous professionals. But it's good to advocate and say, like, you know, it should be on that site. Or if you're actually interested in reconciliation, if you're actually interested in the significance of this site, you should include it on the actual site. I've stopped by a few memorial plaques, like, because I'm a public historian. So when I go on road trips or I go on trips to new towns, new municipalities, sometimes I'll stop and look at plaques, and it'll be for something that's like up the street, and it's incredibly confusing. Same thing with the Shingwauk Hall plaque, its placement. A lot of people think that the Bishop Fouquet Memorial Chapel is Shingwauk Hall, which is not correct. So I think it becomes less relevant when it's removed from the site. If you're removing it from the site, there's suddenly less significance. There's suddenly less context for people who maybe aren't familiar with that site or in the community. It also, especially when we're talking about Indigenous artifacts or Indigenous sites that are being, you know, recognized or unearthed through development, I think we need to talk really about, you know, the fact that land back is important, but also too that when you put it down the street or across the street or away from the actual site it was on, you're once again dispossessing and including and like not including Indigenous people on their own land. And I think that that's like a further that's like a further enacted harm of settler colonialism. You remove people from their site. That's the actual act of settler colonialism. So I think maybe bringing that up is important. I don't know how much private industry listens to those things. In my experience, it wasn't a lot, especially when you look like me, or if you have a voice like me that's very high pitched. A lot of men in private corporations don't listen to you. But I mean, when community action or community reaction is directed at them and people are justful and rightfully upset, they don't understand why, because they feel as though they've done their duty to that community, but not in the right way. So I think there needs to be a lot more advocacy and education for that, and understanding that adding the plaque to the actual site won't decrease its value or decrease, you know, its private, you know, property standing. It's just going to recognize the significance and the real historical narrative of that site. So sorry for the long-winded answer.
It was great. I do have another question for you. You're okay with that? So can you talk a bit about archival methodologies in history and how they repeat the colonizing gaze, particularly thinking about various institutional collections and repositories of materials, such as photographs, for example, of Indigenous communities that historians might be discussing in their research?
Yeah, for sure. So as somebody who does a lot of historical research and a lot of writing on Indigenous communities, I have to utilize archives. And as someone who's worked in archives, as well as somebody who works with archives, I can see the repetitive nature of, settler colonial systems or white supremacist systems repeating themselves within archival structures. From description, which I mean, if it's dated, they're trying to update it, especially at LAC, but I mean, the original description is still going to be there. A lot of times the original creator of the material is somebody who was sent in by the government or who is working for the settler colonial state or was a settler themselves or somebody completely foreign. And they might not know the context of the thing that they're talking about, but because they're in the historical record, they're suddenly considered like an authority or like an actual account of heritage. I saw really great discourse actually on Indigenous Twitter about, looking at diaries and accounts from settlers or colonizers should be less of an official record for us to learn about Indigenous people, but rather to learn about the settler colonial ethnology. But because, archives and settler colonial created materials are what we have preserved and what we have kept is why, scholarship is geared the way it is, and it's the information we have available. But I think an important thing for researchers working on this who aren't Indigenous is to be critical, look at images especially, and in the descriptions and see if these things actually match up, if the communities described this is really happening. Because I've seen photographs of people wearing ceremonial clothing in an area where they didn't even have that type of clothing historically, or they didn't engage in those types of ceremonies. It was really just for show, especially in the 50s and 60s. So a lot of inaccuracy in historical scholarship stems from archival structures. And as for archives themselves, we can be really limited by the rules for archival description. They don't give a lot of direction on, how to handle different types of materials. There's very little information on how to handle material culture. So building ceremony into archives is something that I know we've done in the past at the Shingwauk Residential School Center, and something that I know other archives are working towards. But when those things are built in to the structures and things are accurately described, correct ownership is attributed. So if a donor submits a lot of beaded material or art created by an Indigenous person, it should be attributed to that Indigenous person, not the person who donated it. It really helps to shift focus and change the narrative in education as well as in historiography, because whatever we create as public historians or as historians proper, like in the academic sense, I guess, which the lines for me are kind of blurred, but that is what people read. That's what people read in popular press. That's what people read on the internet. That's what kids learn in schools. And the more it's based off of structures that are deeply rooted in settler colonial white supremacy, the more that those narratives are going to perpetuate themselves and things aren't going to be fixed.
Thanks so much, Skylee-Storm. I think that really well addressed that question. And I think also ties to your earlier point around the importance of building relationships. Because I think a lot of this work in commemoration as well as archives is dependent on that relationship and working with Indigenous communities and not working in isolation. Because I think historically that's one of the problems with archival description. And I know you and I have kind of talked about this at length, but how just working as, you know, a white professional, my description of something is not going to be nearly as good or as accurate as if I was working with like a survivor organization.
For sure. I've found too that having partnerships extending beyond like just traditional people, even if you're having partnerships with a variety of different individuals from different Indigenous lived experiences. So folks who've grown up off reserve and urban settings, folks from northern communities, folks from West versus folks from East, the more perspective that you have on your commemoration project, depending on the relevant scale. Of course, here, if you're talking national, you're going to have to do a lot more consultation and community building. But the problem I see is a lot of organizations will start the community building process, you know, a year or 2 years out, depending on the length of their grant funding or depending on the scope of the project, or if there's a big anniversary coming up, they start relatively too close to the actual intended unveiling date. And they just reach out to a cultural center, they reach out to a band government, and they're like, hey, we want to do this project, you want to be involved? And it's just like, you know, it's like a cold call. And I know that a lot of Indigenous people feel very uncomfortable with that. There's people that I've talked to for oral history, or people that I've talked to during my documentary project, where, you know, I still send them periodical emails every couple months, or, you know, they say, hey, I ran into your aunt at this grocery store today, like, how's it going? Like stuff like that. It's not just like, oh, we extracted information from you, or like we've checked off our boxes for this grant and now we've created this thing. And it's the pinnacle of equity and diversity. It's really about what happens not only before, but after. It's keeping an actual reciprocal, honest relationship with the community and responding in the right way. I've seen it a lot where, you know, they come into the community, it's big fanfare, we're gonna have such a great partnership, it's gonna be a wonderful long relationship, and then suddenly 2-3 years down the road, nothing exists, you know, and that makes commemoration, or it makes exhibits, or it makes history practice not genuine, not relevant to reconciliation, or relevant to the changing needs of the country.
Thanks so much. We probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. If anybody has any, feel free to either raise your hand or use the chat. We'll give it a second just to see if there's any last questions.
I'm also available by email, so Skylee-Storm@nohistory.ca. I'm also available on Twitter at Storm9115. So I do often talk about this type of stuff. I've been really excited about the plaque and working away on that a lot, but also too working with other Indigenous historians, specifically Haudenosaunee historians, on talking about public history practice itself. And I think that that's something that really needs to shift. But yeah, I can put my contact information in the chat, that's no problem. But yeah, I think too, the fact that I'm not a visibly Indigenous historian is something that I also take into account when I'm working on these projects, and whether or not these are my stories to tell, or if I'm doing it on behalf of a client, it's always like, you know, well, what are their needs, and that comes first. But I think the important thing is when we're working on Indigenous projects, and if you're not Indigenous, is to be asking why you're doing it, and to be asking, you know, is it to further your own career, or is it to do something for a community? Is it in the spirit of, like, you know, repatriation? Is it in the spirit of giving back? If it's not, then you might want to reevaluate and take your research direction into the vast, expanse of what is available to settler colonial historians, and create some space for folks who are trying to make it. So that's kind of my gist. It's not always the most popular gist, but it's what I've seen in the field, and it's what's been expressed to me from other Haudenosaunee and other historians who are Indigenous in the field or who are Black, is, create that space and let us have our own voices.
Willa, I see your hand.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. I didn't fully form my thought, but first, obviously, Chimigwech for this amazing presentation. And I just, yeah, something about what you were saying at the end just made me think about like being the Indigenous historian doing this, and just like if you had any words of encouragement, but also words for the non-Indigenous coworkers and people who will be hiring us and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. As for words of encouragement, it persist. It's not going to be easy to do this work. It's not always going to be easy. It's not always going to be easy to work for institutions or organizations or companies that are primarily non-Indigenous. They're either going to tokenize you or they're going to disregard your indigeneity completely because they're afraid of tokenizing you. And it's a frustrating position. And sometimes you really want to share how you feel, but you also are very aware and cognizant of the heritage fields, employment precarity, and you have to really do a delicate dance. But all I can say is when you stick with it and you're honest and you work with your integrity and you do your best to work with places that share your values, you will eventually get ahead. And it's worth it and it feels good. And sometimes you're going to be tired. Sometimes you're going to be overworked. Sometimes you're going to be emotionally exhausted. But in the end, it's worth it to keep doing the work. And as for non-Indigenous coworkers, I've been really fortunate where a lot of my non-Indigenous coworkers have been incredibly supportive. They've been honest with me. They've asked me questions. They've reached out when they're just like, should I be doing this? What is this? Or like they have a question about what it's like to be a status Indian, or what that entails, or what the history of that is, and how that interacts with policy. And I've been very fortunate there. But what I can say to people who maybe work closely with Indigenous folks in their organization or on their committees or et cetera is really just like, yeah, like make sure they're adequately supported, reach out to them, offer support. If you realize that somebody on your committee or in the boardroom is really monopolizing the time and the voice, say, I really think that we should ask this person what they think about this, or interject and say like, these are all very great points. But I think, we need some other voices. And I think that simple intervention goes a long way for making Indigenous people feel welcome and valued and like they're a member of the team, because it's often very isolating. And I know, Willa, how that feels. So keep at it.
Great. Thanks so much for that question, Willa. I really appreciate it. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat or any other hands raised. So I think I just want to say a huge thank you for everybody attending, but also a huge thank you to you, Skylee-Storm. I think this was a really fruitful conversation, a really wonderful presentation. And as always, it's wonderful to work with you and to host you in this space. So Chimigwech, everyone. And I did pop Skylee-Storm's email in the chat if anybody was looking for it.
And I look forward to having the plaque unveiled and maybe doing a couple more talks this summer with the SRC, either about that process or about our future projects coming up. So really excited to connect with the community. And if anybody has any questions or wants to reach out, please don't hesitate.
Thanks all. I hope everybody has a great day.